So, Havi, you're a philosopher keenly interested in illness. You've written a book by that name, and you engage quite widely with patients and medics and policymakers on the topic. I wonder if you could tell me how you got started thinking about it.
So it was triggered by my personal experience of illness. In 2006, I was diagnosed with a respiratory condition, and my earlier interest in philosophy, and in particular in phenomenology, which is a philosophical approach that invites us to focus on human experience and how we might describe and discern it, very much came kind of under scrutiny for me, because the thing I was thinking when I was diagnosed is, if philosophy can't help me cope with this kind of life-changing event, then it doesn't really do that much. So I was very pleased when I realised that philosophy can be applied in really useful ways to our understanding of illness. So it can help in several ways. The first is that we can take a set of philosophical concepts. For example, you take this idea of the human being as being in the world, which is Heidegger's formulation. And you can think of illness as changing not just a particular bodily function or causing a particular kind of dysfunction, but actually changing the entire way in which you can be in the world.
Right.
So I think it helps to bring out the existential impact illness has on somebody's life, and also the extent to which that impact can't be compartmentalized to a particular bodily organ or bodily function in the way that I think modern healthcare tends to do.
So maybe you might say that natural science is effective because it can quantify, but it's hard to quantify that kind of human experience, which is why phenomenology can help.
I think they're deeply, well, they're in tension, but they're also complementary, these two approaches. So I think the goal of medical science is really to understand disease mechanisms and disease processes, and to then try and ameliorate them. But of course, the ways in which a particular medical condition might impact on someone might not be captured completely by a pure medical examination or medical account of that condition.
Okay.
So it's the way I see it. I think that it can complement medical science and clinical science, but it can also give clinicians some very useful tools with which they can maybe communicate better with patients, maybe understand more of their experiences, and maybe treat them in a way that would make the ill people feel better looked after, or that their suffering is more recognised.
Okay. I gather you've created one such sort of phenomenological toolkit for patients. Can you talk about that?
So the toolkit has 3 components to it, or 3 steps. And in the first step, the toolkit, which is run as a workshop, which involves patients and health professionals and facilitators, invites the participants to maybe bracket or suspend the kinds of presuppositions that they have about illness. That it ought to be experienced in a particular way, that it ought to be understood in a particular way, that it ought to be borne in a particular way by people who are ill, and to try and move away from the sense that there is a socially scripted and restricted way which is the correct way to understand illness.
Okay.
In the second step, we invite the participants to thematize their experience, and that means to try and look at the illness through a variety of perspectives. So it would appear very differently to the ill person herself than to, say, a family member or a carer, to a health professional, to a stranger on the street. So try and thematize and create a kind of multi-perspectival view of the illness. And then in the third step, we ask them to try and construct their own understanding of illness, which is, again, it can be idiosyncratic, it can be very personal, but it's not restricted by the medical understanding or by the prevalent social norms or by any kind of prescriptive view that might delimit the way in which people understand it. In the hope that people will emerge from the workshop with a better understanding of their own illness experience and of their own definition or conception of illness.
Okay, so it sort of enables them to take charge in a way?
Yes, very much so. So the idea is that through this exercise in self-reflection and discerning and ordering their own experiences, because of course illness experiences can be traumatic and confusing and disorienting, but also to communicate them better to health professionals. And I think the health professionals who participated in these workshops found them very useful because they thought that they brought out aspects of the illness experience that wasn't necessarily salient to them as clinicians.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you whether you'd had any resistance from medics who'll say to you, what do I need philosophy for? I do care about the patient's whole world and I would love to take care of it, but it's my economic framework rather than my metaphysical framework that's at fault. What would you say in defence of philosophy's?
Well, I guess the beauty of this proposal is that all it requires really is a kind of attitudinal shift.
Okay.
So people can engage with phenomenology of illness or read my book and have particular thoughts or particular responses to it, or might modify their practice or communicate differently with their patients. But there's no requirement. People don't need to have a very deep philosophical understanding or some kind of lengthy philosophical training in order to make that shift.
I guess one pitfall people might have coming to your work is to conflate it with the kind of positive thinking industry, though I imagine you'd like to draw quite a harsh distinction between what you're saying and the sort of you can will yourself better crowd.
Oh, definitely. I think that the kind of positive thinking that you're describing can be really pretty toxic for an ill person, because it either insinuates or clearly states that it is their fault / responsibility / blame that they are ill, or that they remain ill, or that they don't get better. Which is of course a terrible thing. It's kind of, it's a bit of a double whammy to say you've been hit by an illness, and then on top of that there's also this kind of line of reasoning that might make you think that you're responsible for the illness in some sense. And of course it also often offers false hope, in that if you try hard enough, if you eat lots of carrots, if you go on this diet, if you do, and of course that's just an attempt to increase the overall volume of the things that are within our control, within the situation where ultimately we have very little control. And I think that's another, insight that we might glean from illness, is this understanding that ultimately we're very vulnerable. We're vulnerable in a bodily sense, but we're also vulnerable to misfortune and affliction, and that these types of events cannot always be prevented by good behavior, eating a healthy diet, and those kinds of things. I think at the very core of successful encounter with illness lies what I call reflective coping, which is your ability to encounter a challenge, but then respond to it through a genuine reflection on your own actions, goals, values, and so on. You could say the limit of one's control is, how do I choose to respond to this?
So you talk a lot about mental flourishing within illness. Can you expand upon that?
Yes, so I think there is an interesting notion that comes up in the nursing literature from the 90s, which is called health within illness, which I've taken up and sort of paraphrased as thinking about wellness within illness. So I think we've got this misconception that ill health necessarily commits people to a life of misery. But we have very robust empirical data that this is not the case, that ill people, severely, chronically ill people, are only a little bit less happy than healthy controls in those studies. And of course you can question the data, and of course people have suggested it's a form of self-denial, that people are just not realizing or not acknowledging the extent of devastation that the illness has caused their lives. But you can also accept this data at face value and say, well, so looks like ultimately it doesn't affect people's well-being that much. And there's studies showing that people with breast cancer, people on dialysis 3 or 4 times a week, have a pretty reasonable level of well-being. So the question arises, what makes that happen? And people have been wondering and trying to characterize the foundations of, say, resilience or a positive outlook, of acceptance, of adaptation. And one thing that is really clear from this data is that people adapt to physical limitations pretty effectively and pretty quickly. So within a year or so, their levels of well-being of people who are diagnosed seem to kind of bounce back to their baseline level. And that's pretty interesting, because you think, well, we're pouring all this money into healthcare, but actually it looks like the diseases don't have the kind of devastating impact that we might think they would have. And I think that opens really interesting philosophical questions. For example, how do we interpret the data? Do we want to say that these people are honestly and frankly assessing their situation? If adaptation to ill health is so effective, then should we change the way in which we fund healthcare? Or maybe we should actually think that people who are healthy don't have a very good grasp of their level of well-being, or that there might be some positive outcomes of illness, positive and unintended outcomes. So maybe, for example, it makes people more balanced. Maybe it helps them to focus on what's really important in life. Maybe they get less upset about small and trivial things, and all of these things contribute to these levels of well-being.
Right.
And it might also be that we're much more adaptable than we think we are. So if somebody thinks about being, afflicted by a certain disease or a certain disability, they might think they will not be able to cope with it, or will never be able to be happy in that condition. But maybe that's because they overweight the significance of that condition, and actually people who live in that condition seem to think it's not all that bad.
Right.
So it throws up interesting questions about what is the role of adaptation, how does it actually work, and how plastic our capacity for well-being actually is. But the thing I think this data does very effectively is it dispels the notion that ill health necessarily entails misery.
Right. It reminds me of that final interview with Dennis Potter. Have you ever seen that?
No.
It's really nice. He's talking to Melvin Bragg, and he's dying of cancer, I think, and throughout the interview he's swigging morphine the whole time. But he's just talking about the way that he looks out of his window and he sees the blossom on the trees, and it's the kind of most blossom he's ever seen, and he's kind of got this very zen kind of attitude. Yeah.
No, I mean, you might say that it heightens your ability to enjoy the present, which is, a very, very central goal of say, groups like the Stoics. This ability to be in the present. So if you know that your prognosis is poor and that the future is dire, and you manage to really block that off, then you might say your ability to be in the present is enhanced in that sense. Okay,
so in the closing chapters of your book, you talk a bit about death and dealing with death, and you say that a longer and longer life of happy moments isn't necessarily preferable to a shorter life of happy moments, and I wonder how you make that case.
So again, this is a really interesting area, really fantastic philosophical literature on death and the value of life. You might say that more is always better than less, the way Nagel says it is, that more life is better than less life, and that you kind of accumulate the goodness of life by having increasing amounts of it, or living increasing amounts of it. So of course a longer life would be preferable to a shorter one. But if you think about the situation of ill people who have a poor prognosis, that way of thinking, the kind of quantitative view of the goodness of life, seems very dispiriting. And I think people in that situation want to find sources of value and meaning of life that are not necessarily linked to longevity. So you might, again, in a Stoic vein, turn to this idea of being in the present and think about our very limited ability to be in the present, especially in the context of a modern life, and the way in which cultivating that ability could be a huge achievement for somebody in that situation of say, terminal stage of an illness or poor prognosis, where the future is really uncertain, survival is uncertain, and moreover, the quality of life you might have in the coming months or years is also uncertain or doesn't look very good. So I think in those situations, moving away from an understanding of life as an accumulation of good moments, and looking more towards preserving and enhancing the quality of each instant might be more meaningful.